Thank you all for coming, and what a special treat it is to be able to talk about economic opportunity with Raj Chetty. I've known Raj since he was a graduate student, and I got to say that one of the things I've noticed in economics is when people get Genius Awards, and the Clark Medal, and tenure at Harvard, their productivity often goes down. And the thing about Raj is that I've never seen anyone's productivity skyrocket as much as it has over the last few years, because Raj is taking advantage of big data techniques to learn things that, frankly, people of Teresa and my age, we never thought we could study stuff like this. And at the Milken Center for Advancing the American Dream, Mike Milken has made it absolutely clear that it's not just a center where you're going to go and hear amazing stories, as we've heard in some of the events around in the last couple of nights, but it's also a center where our #1 mission is to advance the American dream. And that means we need to know, how's it doing? Who has access to it? Who doesn't have access to it? The places where we're adopting policies to attempt to address the inequality of access to the American dream, which ones are working? And in that regard, Raj has kindly offered to come and join us and talk about the work that he's been doing. And the way we're going to organize the session is Raj is going to give you a kind of greatest hits album of some of the amazing work he's been doing over the last 6-7 years. 2017 maybe was the first paper. And then we're going to pause, and I'm going to ask him a few questions about that. And then we're going to move on to the latest work that he's doing. And then I'm going to try to cajole him in giving us a little bit of a glimpse of a paper that's coming out in a couple months, because my understanding is that it's the best paper yet. That's the whisper number on Raj's next paper. So with that, Raj, thank you so much for coming. And could you please give people a little bit of the greatest hits of the amazing work you're doing, advancing economic mobility at Opportunity Insights?
All right. Well, thanks so much, Kevin. Thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to have a chance to talk with you. So I want to start out, when we talk about the American dream, by just talking about what we mean. How do we measure the American dream at a national level? So there are many different aspects to the American dream. I think one important cornerstone of it is the aspiration that we at least aim to be a country where, through hard work, any child can move up in the income distribution relative to their parents. That was the kind of notion that drew my own parents to come to this country as immigrants, and countless other folks. And so I want to start out in this first chart here by showing you an assessment my colleagues and I did a few years ago of whether America is actually living up to that aspiration of being a place that offers high rates of upward mobility. So what we did is calculate a very simple statistic. We measure what fraction of children go on to earn more than their parents did, measuring both kids' and parents' incomes in their mid-30s. And we're looking at that data here by the year in which the child was born, starting all the way on the far left, where you can see that for kids born back in 1940, it was a virtual guarantee that you were going to achieve the American dream of moving up. 92% of kids born in America in 1940, we estimate, went on to earn more than their parents did. But if you look at what has happened over time, you can see that there's been a dramatic fading of the American dream, such that for children born in the middle of the 1980s, who are turning 30 around now when we're measuring their incomes as adults, it's become essentially a 50-50 shot, a coin flip, as to whether you're going to achieve the American dream. And so this broad trend is, of course, of great interest to economists like myself and Kevin. I would argue it's also of fundamental social and political interest in the US, because I think it's this very trend that underlies a lot of the frustration that people around the United States are expressing, that this is no longer a country where it's easy to get ahead, even through hard work. And I think that's manifested in a lot of different outcomes that we're seeing. So in our research group at Harvard, which I direct, Opportunity Insights, we're focused on the big picture question of what is driving this fading of the American dream, and more importantly, what can we do to create more upward mobility going forward? And as Kevin mentioned, we're not the first to study these kinds of questions. People have been interested in economic opportunity and inequality and progress for decades. The key new tool that we're bringing to bear on these issues is big data. We're in the era of data. And in particular, our team is working with very large data sets from the government, from private companies, that, as I will show you in the next few minutes, can give us a much sharper lens into understanding the science of economic opportunity. So let me start with this map here, which comes from one of our earlier papers. I'll take a second to describe how we construct this map using large-scale data, and then tell you what it's showing. So what we do here is take data on 20 million kids born in the US in the early 1980s, essentially all kids born in America at that time. And we used information from anonymized tax returns covering the entire US population to link these kids back to their parents and measure their chances of upward mobility based on where they grew up. And we calculate a very simple measure of upward mobility. We ask, what is your average household income when you're 35 years old, based on your 1040 tax return, if you grew up in a low-income family? And I'm going to define a low-income family here as a family that makes $27,000 a year, which puts you at the 25th percentile of the US national income distribution. So to give you an example, the Boston metro area where I'm from, kids who grew up in families making $27,000 a year, on average, when we look at their 1040 tax filings, when they're 35, are making about $37,000 a year. You can construct that statistic for all of the different metro and rural areas in the US. We color the map so that red colors are places where you're less likely to rise up, and green colors represent places with higher levels of upward mobility. So first, very simple point. If you look at the scale in the lower right-hand side of this chart, you can see that even in present-day America, there's an enormous amount of variation in children's chances of rising up. There are many parts of the US, like take rural Iowa, for example, a place like Dubuque, Iowa. You would not necessarily think of Dubuque, Iowa as like the center of economic opportunity. Turns out if you're growing up in a low-income family, your odds of rising to the middle class or beyond look terrific in Dubuque and many other parts of rural Iowa, where you have average incomes are $45,000 or $50,000 one generation later. Yet you have other places like Charlotte, North Carolina. Many of you might know a vibrant city that has experienced tremendous economic progress, financial center, and so on in the past couple of decades. Yet if you grow up in a family making $27,000 a year, you're actually making less than your parents were on average one generation later, showing you that jobs and growth in and of themselves are not necessarily enough to bring people up in that community. And so the question becomes, this map I think is interesting, both because it's interesting to observe the spatial variation, but also it gives us a new tool to study the science of economic opportunity. Can make an analogy to having a microscope for the first time, rather than just looking at the national trends and asking what was different in 1950 in America versus today. It's going to be 100 different things. Here you can start to ask what's different about Salt Lake City versus Charlotte. Maybe even more sharply, zooming in now in subsequent work, we can look neighborhood by neighborhood. Here's an example from New York City. If you're interested, you can look up data for any city you're interested in at this website.
In fact, let me just add that you can go to his website and type in your own zip code,
Exactly.
and then you'll find out exactly everything about your own hometown.
Exactly. You can type in your address actually and see, neighborhood by neighborhood. How did kids do on average who grew up in your area, 2 miles down the road? Not just income, but various other outcomes and so on. Here I'm giving you a snapshot of that data for New York. And I want to make a simple point here. We haven't changed the color scale, but notice that the spectrum of colors that you see in New York, from red to green, is the same as what I was showing you in the national map. And what that's telling you is you can go 2 miles down the road in New York, and it's like you're going from Alabama to Iowa in terms of your chances of moving up. So these issues are originating at a hyper-local neighborhood level rather than at a broad regional level, which starts to give you a sense of the kinds of factors we maybe need to think about to improve economic opportunity. So next step, naturally the question is, what is different about parts of Queens versus Brooklyn versus the Bronx that are leading to very different outcomes for kids, starting at the same family income level, same demographics in many cases, and so on. So we've done a series of studies, and I'm not going to go through all of those in detail, but just very high-level summary. What you find is that where you grow up really matters for your life outcomes. We've done a series of studies where you can track millions of kids moving from one of these red-colored neighborhoods to the green-colored neighborhoods, and you can see that your outcomes improve in proportion to the number of years that you're growing up in these higher opportunity areas. So the community in which you grow up has a really profound causal effect on your prospects for upward mobility. So why is that? So this brings us to basically, trying to understand the recipe for upward mobility, which we and many others are now doing with these kinds of data. And just to summarize in a nutshell, what you find there, you find that neighborhoods that offer high levels of upward mobility tend to have 4 characteristics. They tend to have relatively low poverty rates. They tend to be mixed income integrated areas. They tend to have more stable family structures, more 2-parent families, for example. They tend to have, as you might expect intuitively, better schools at the K through 12 level and in terms of access to higher education. And finally, they tend to have greater social capital. Now, Mike Milken talks a lot about social capital. Lots of folks here are interested in this concept. It's been discussed over the decades. What exactly is social capital, though? How can we measure it? How can we manipulate it? This is another place where I want to show you how modern data can help us really sharpen our understanding. And to do that, I'm going to turn to this pair of maps here, where the map on the left is the map of the geography of upward mobility drawn using tax records that I showed you initially. The map on the right is a very different map. It's a map of what we're calling economic connectedness, a measure of the degree to which low-income people are friends with high-income people, the degree of cross-class interaction in each county in America. And how do we measure that? We set up a collaboration with Mark Zuckerberg and Meta and the Facebook core data science team to use data on 72 million users of Facebook and ask county by county, if you're a low-income person on Facebook, what fraction of your Facebook friends have high above median income? In this map on the right, green colors are places where people are interacting more across class lines, and red colors are places with more cross-class disconnection. And you can see the result for yourself. You don't need any fancy statistics here. It's totally obvious these 2 maps look incredibly similar to each other. Yeah. The places, we see this systematically, not just at this geographic level, but much more generally, the single strongest predictor of your chances of rising up is how connected you are to higher income folks. What are the mechanisms there? It could be things like getting a job referral, getting an internship. Often that's the most common way to find a job in America. But I think even more deeply, it could be about how you shape kids' aspirations. If you've never met somebody who went to college, you don't think about that as a possibility for you. If you're in a community where you've seen more people succeed in certain career pathways, that can maybe change kids' lives. And so our sense is social capital in combination with a number of the other things is really a critical factor in creating more mobility and ultimately may point to solutions.
So in economics, going way back to when I was in grad school, they had this thing they called the flypaper effect. Yeah. And the basic idea is that if you sort of drop people down on a map, then are they stuck where you drop them, or can they move? And what Raj has shown is that this flypaper effect is really significant. And it really matters where you land on the flypaper. And so one of the questions you could have is, well, can we go into those places where there isn't a lot of opportunity and make them better with lots of investments and education and maybe charter schools or whatever? Or should we help people move? And which is more cost effective? And I know, Raj, you've done a lot of work on this. And so could you help us think about that?
Yeah. Thanks, Kevin. So, that naturally sets the stage for the next step in this analysis. So I've shown you a bunch of things on what drives economic mobility. As Kevin is saying, what can we now do to increase economic mobility going forward? And so to pivot to that, let me just first lay out how I think about these questions. So what we've learned is that the roots of these differences in economic mobility are hyper-local. It's about where you're growing up within something like a half-a-mile radius of your home. Factors like social capital and schools and so on matter. So given that theory of the world, I think you would naturally think about 3 different ways to increase mobility. One, as Kevin just said, is to reduce segregation. If there's a place in New York that offers much better prospects for upward mobility, why not help low-income families move to those places? Second possibility is what I'd call place-based investment. Rather than bringing people to opportunity, bring opportunity to people where they currently live. Turn the red-colored places in the map into green colors. A third key point of intervention, recognizing that after age 18, the most common place where kids are is not the home in which they grow up, but rather their institution of higher education, is trying to make our colleges more effective in terms of increasing mobility. So our team has done quite a bit of work in each of these domains. Let me give you a quick snapshot of the first couple in response to your question. So on this first issue of reducing segregation. So in the US, you might know that we spend a tremendous amount of money, about $45 billion per year, on affordable housing, trying to get families to better areas, to more stable housing, to better neighborhoods that might help them escape poverty. I want to give you an example of one program on which we spend a particularly large amount of resources, housing vouchers, what used to be called Section 8 vouchers. About 2.5 million families get these vouchers every year. They're worth about $1,500 a month of rental assistance. So what we've done in this map here is taken a snapshot of that Opportunity Atlas data for Seattle. And we've overlaid in those bright green dots, if you look carefully for those dots, those bright green dots are the most common places where families receiving a housing voucher from the federal government currently live. And you might notice a puzzling pattern with those dots, which is that they're clustered in the red and orange colored parts of the map, not the green colored parts of the map where families are actually going to experience upward mobility based on what I was talking about earlier. And so when we put out this data a few years ago, the Housing and Urban Development Agency of the federal government and the Seattle and King County housing authorities approached us and said, we noticed this puzzling pattern, can we figure out why this is happening? Can we make the program more effective by actually helping more families move to opportunity? And so what came out of that was a randomized trial with 1,000 families that came to apply for housing vouchers, where we basically tried to test strategies to help families move to opportunity. And what we did is a very simple, what I would think of as a social capital intervention. We provided people with, think of it as essentially a broker, in the same way that people are happy to help you find housing at the high end of the housing market, because there's money in that. At the low end of the housing market, there's very little assistance. You're basically given the voucher and said, good luck finding housing wherever you'd like. And so we worked with a nonprofit to say, okay, if you want to move to a high opportunity area, we're going to try to facilitate that. We'll connect you with landlords, we'll provide a little bit of support in the process, and so on. Relatively inexpensive intervention, costs $2,500 per family, 2% of the cost of the voucher itself. So what did this do? You can follow families over time, set up as a randomized trial. You can see that the families that received this additional assistance in the treatment group, more than half of them end up moving to one of those green-colored places on the map, one of the high opportunity areas, compared to only 14% in the control group. And Kevin, we estimate, based on our prior work, that the kids who got lucky and ended up in the green bar are going to end up earning about $200,000 more over their lifetimes, basically because of that flip of the coin, that they got that additional service relative to the kids in the control. So to show you how I think this kind of work can ultimately matter, after we did that work in Seattle, there was a bill passed in Congress with bipartisan sponsors authorizing about $80 million of funding to replicate what we did in Seattle and 8 other cities in America. That demonstration is currently happening. But more importantly, there's another bill that's been proposed in Congress, again with a Republican and Democratic co-sponsor, proposing a $5 billion per year expansion of the housing voucher program along these lines, now that we know that it can be made much more effective than it currently is and can really transform people's lives. So that's a long answer to the question you asked of, I think the moving to opportunity desegregation approach can work, but I think we need to spend our dollars in much smarter ways than we're currently doing for it to actually have an effect. Now, to make one final point on this, I don't want to give the impression that I think just the desegregation approach, moving people to different areas, is the only thing we should do. Obviously, that's not going to be a scalable approach in and of itself. And so the other way to think about it is exactly what Kevin raised, place-based investment. How do you transform places from low opportunity to high opportunity? Our understanding of how to do this is much more nascent from a scientific point of view. I don't think people really know the answer to the question. If you were to ask, what do I do in my place to turn it into a high mobility area? We don't quite know yet. Let me give you a flavor of the kinds of things that are happening that I think are interesting and could connect with some of what you all might do in your own work. So when we put out the data in that map I showed you initially of upward mobility across cities, one of the things that came out and that I mentioned initially is that Charlotte is one of the lowest mobility cities in America. It ranks 50th out of the 50 largest cities in America in terms of your chances of rising up. So in Charlotte, people got really motivated by this. There was a number of articles in the local newspaper bemoaning that fact. There was an event held with the Charlotte Hornets raising awareness about economic mobility, 50th out of 50. And I've been really encouraged to see what came out of that. So there have been a number of changes in Charlotte to try to promote economic mobility, a tremendous amount of investment by nonprofits, investing about $200 million in a combination of different programs, from mentoring to pre-K readiness to access to higher education and so on, to try to create more pathways to mobility. To give you a private sector example that might resonate with some folks here, you might know Bank of America is headquartered in Charlotte. And so Bank of America started to recognize with these data that while they were bringing many high-paying jobs to Charlotte, they were basically importing the talent to fill those jobs rather than actually creating opportunities for the kids growing up in Charlotte itself. So they made a commitment to hire 1,000 kids who grew up in low-income families in Charlotte itself. And they recognized that there was a reason they weren't hiring those kids to begin with. So they teamed up with a job training provider called Year Up to provide a one-year program to equip these kids with the skills needed to get those jobs at Bank of America. And that's going to create pathways to upward mobility, at a small scale, but 1,000 people is not nothing, and is an example of what I think can be done with companies partnering with other groups to really change things on the ground in a place.
On this one, I just want to add that at the Center for the American Dream, I'm running the Mobility Project, and one of the visions that Mike Milken has is that he has all these friends who, as everyone in this room, we care so desperately about this, perhaps the most important economic problem facing our country, and they want to do something, but they don't know what, and some of them have adopted programs, but they don't know whether they worked or not. And what we're hoping to do is to partner with Raj to help evaluate all of these programs so that we can figure out which ones worked and which ones didn't, but also to empower the private sector also to experiment. So it doesn't pay to experiment if you can't learn what happens. And what Raj has done and what we want to help him advance is build a tool so that people can experiment and then find out what works. And one of the things, and as Raj knows, I've been working on this for so long, and I see John Lettieri from EIG in the front, that I have focused a lot on the middle one. And that's why Jared Bernstein, the Biden administration, and I were the inventors, really, along with Sean Parker, of opportunity zones. And we wanted to get capital to these places. But I think that there's a revolution coming, you can see, and it was really started by Raj. And the final thing I want to say is that I want to give a charge to the audience, thinking about ways that you can make a difference on these segregation and mobility things is something I would really ask you to do. And I want to talk just, again, a little thing that I did. I started something, John knows this, called the Urban Baseball Foundation. And I worked really hard to desegregate youth sports in DC, only in DC, because that's where I lived. And so we built connections between kids from Anacostia and kids from Northwest and so on. And now I've watched the kids from Anacostia, whose parents I never met because there was one mom that drove 6 kids to the games and stuff because everybody had a job, and watched them succeed. And so one of the kids on my team is now the head baseball coach at Landon. Another kid just paid me a lot of money to give a speech at his financial firm's conference. But the point is that these connections can really matter, and you can help forge those connections. Yeah. But we've got just about 5 minutes left, Raj. I know that you've got a lot of stuff cooking. Can we possibly get a glimpse of what the next questions are that you're asking?
Yeah, absolutely, Kevin. Let me just first echo what you said. You just gave an example of social capital and walked through why we're seeing those patterns in the Facebook data. One of the things we see that's very interesting in the Facebook data is it's exactly things like recreational activities or sometimes religious institutions where people make those cross-class connections at much higher rates than what you see elsewhere. And so I think that very deliberate way that you attempted
and it's worth it. I still, maybe once every other month in DC, some kid says, "Coach has it," and then I get a hug. And it's worth all the time.
Yes. I also want to come back to the point that Kevin made on evaluation. So I think lots of folks here are doing great things in terms of making investments to try to create a difference in your communities at a national scale. But unlike in the private sector, where of course you go to great lengths to try to evaluate whether those investments are having a high rate of return, I find in the public sector and in philanthropy, there's much less focus on evaluation, on rates of return, and it's equally important there, right? And so just to show you an example of how that can look. So here's an analysis we've done of this Year Up job training program that I mentioned earlier that's been brought to Charlotte by Bank of America. So to give you a sense of how you can do this analysis, we basically take data on this program. This was done as a randomized trial, but that's actually not necessary. And what we do is we link that data to the data on tax records that our team works with. This is the vision that we have in collaborating with the Milken Institute and Kevin's team. And so we basically are able to follow these children over time. In the treatment group, they participated in the Year Up program in 2014. While they were participating in the program, they had lower levels of earnings because they weren't working as much. But then you can see afterward, their earnings, this is from W-2 earnings data from tax filings, they surge and they remain higher, 35% higher than the kids who didn't have access to the program for years to come. So this is very clear evidence that this program has strong positive effects. It's now being scaled across the country. For those of you who are in the private sector hiring folks, you can team up with programs like this to hire, to basically find talent. And the question is, for all the other programs, the types that Kevin's describing, many of you are familiar with, do they have this kind of effect or do they not? I think we really want to know the answers to that so that we can invest more smartly to really make a difference. Now, in terms of where we're headed, and just to kind of wrap up, I think one way you might think about these issues of the American dream is from the perspective of fairness and what this country is about and what draws people to come to America. And I think all of that's very important. But I think there's another motivation, which is just generating talent to power our economy going forward, which I think is one of the most important things for economic growth in the United States. And so just to show you a piece of data that illustrates that, innovation, I think, is really at the heart of economic growth. In one of our studies, we linked data on patent rates, on patenting, to the tax records to understand who becomes an inventor in America. And what you can see here is that if you happen to be born to parents in the top 1% of the income distribution, you're 10 times more likely to become an inventor than if you happen to be born to lower income parents. We go on to do subsequent analysis to show that a lot of this is because of the environments that kids are exposed to, where they're growing up, and so on. And what comes from that, the bottom line is that we have a big phenomenon of what I would call lost Einsteins in America, where we estimate in the study that if women, kids from underrepresented minority backgrounds, and kids from low-income families were to invent at the same rate as high-income white men, we'd have 4 times as many inventors in America as we currently do, with commensurate changes in technology and medicine and growth that I think would benefit all of us. So that's what I feel is at stake. And so, looking forward, what are we hoping to do? The next study that we'll put out that Kevin is kind of mentioning in a few weeks is on how opportunity is changing in America by race and by class. So think of the map that I started at the very beginning. How is it changing over time for Black folks, for white folks? And we're finding, Kevin, some really striking patterns of changes by race and class that I think you'll perhaps see in the media that resonate with a lot of what the national discussion is about, and hopefully will pave a way going forward for increasing economic mobility.
So we have a minute left. We get to run a little longer than the less interesting people in the rooms next to us. And so I've got a minute 12. I've got 2 things that I want to say. The first is that we are really serious at the Center for Advancing the American Dream that we're not going to lose any Einsteins. We're going to inspire them, and we're going to find them, and we've got a plan to do it. But the last thing I want to say is that it's the Center for the American Dream, but it's not just the dream of Americans. And I just wanted Raj to give a 30-second plug because he's taken his analysis globally. And he's looking at a lot of other countries. And I know we won't have a lot of time to talk about what you're finding there. But if you come from a country other than the US and you're wondering, how can these techniques apply to my country? The odds are there's a 25-year-old kid on Raj's team that's doing that already. But Raj, do you want to add to that as a final thought?
Absolutely. Yeah, so in our team, Opportunity Insights, we're trying to do research on economic opportunity. We're trying to translate that into applications and ultimately have impacts on policy at scale. I've given you some illustration of that here. We're focused mainly on the United States, but obviously these issues are of global importance. And so some of my former students, a number of collaborators, have replicated the kinds of maps, analyses I've shown you in India, in Brazil, in Scandinavian countries. Often requires quite creative work because the data availability is much more challenging. But a lot of these issues are prevalent there. And I think we are now empowered to find solutions here and beyond.
Well, Raj, thank you so much for joining us here, and thank you all for coming. Thank you.